I'm Keith Nielsen. I am Director of Cloud Architecture at Discover Financial Services. My role here at Discover is to ensure that that we have a cloud strategy that articulates our position on a public cloud adoption, right, versus a private cloud, across all the public cloud providers, right, positioning our solutions across those. The second part is sort of governance and oversight for applications and teams wishing to leverage the cloud to ensure that what they're delivering is done in a well-architected way. It aligns to our strategy for consumption across those cloud providers. Ultimately allows us to deliver business value, right? So I've been in the industry for 25 years. Obviously, with the recent capabilities in the advent of the cloud and Kubernetes, it's sort of been the last 5 years I've been focused in this space. Prior to that, I worked on other distributed platforms, going back decades. So a lot of experience, although the journey to the cloud has been by far the most exciting and challenging. I look forward to sort of sharing some of my learnings today with you. So welcome to the session. My name is Keith Nielsen, Director of Cloud Architecture. Today I'm going to go walk you through sort of Discover's journey to the public cloud, talk about how we've leveraged Kubernetes to realize our strategy, and walk you through some of the lessons learned and challenges. Furthermore, we're going to talk about, one of the most important aspects, for a financial services company is how we've secured Kubernetes in a public hybrid cloud setting. So hopefully you're at the right session. Let's get into it. Here's the agenda quickly. First of all, I'm going to set the context for Discover and sort of our view of cloud consumption, right? Talk a little bit about our strategy and our approach, right? Then we're going to talk a little bit about our approach to cloud security in general. And then I'll close with some lessons learned, and so hopefully we can short circuit some of the challenges that Discover has faced in our journey, such that you don't sort of have to live those and learn them the hard way. All right, so to make the legal folks happy, there's just some disclaimers that I have to share. Obviously, the views you're about to hear are mine and mine alone, and don't represent Discover as a whole. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Discover's cloud strategy and our Northstar, right? So we established this when we started our Kubernetes journey about 4 or 5 years ago, right? That our vision was for a hybrid cloud that was fit for purpose, right? That would deliver an ecosystem to our development community that allowed for rapid innovation. Right. On top of that, we wanted consistency across our cloud providers, right? We wanted common patterns for security, networking, and physical resources, right? And we didn't want to be encumbered by a bunch of legacy processes that we had, right? That just slow down innovation, right? They slow down the delivery and vision of our strategy. So that was really our North Star, and that sort of shaped us the last 4 years in sort of our journey. So if you look at Discover's cloud footprint, this is representative of sort of our vision of where we want to be in our approach to different cloud providers in different parts of the world, right? It's not 100% accurate. Some of this is forward-looking, right? But it does represent sort of our view of the space, right? And so what's driving us, to take this approach? Well, if you look at Discover, we sort of got 3 main lines of business. Most of you probably know Discover through its Discover card, right? The credit card, right? We've also are heavy into banking now with personal lending, both in the student lending space and personal lending space. And then finally, we have payments networks around the globe, right? And for those of you that are in the financial sector, there's lots of regulations, right, in the financial sector. And so our approach and strategy sort of reflects things that we're trying to accommodate, potentially that may come at us down the road, whether those are increasing regulations, right? These countries are passing regulations around data sovereignty, right? These transactions can't leave the country, And if they do, only under these circumstances. So that's driving us to different sort of strategies. So as you look, we have a blend of most of the public cloud providers, right? And we also have edge scenarios, right? Potentially, there's a lot of places out there where the major cloud providers are not represented. And so colos and edge computing solutions very much are envisioned to be required as we expand globally with some of our capabilities. So that's really our strategy in sort of the degree to which we think we'll consume, right? The public cloud. So if you look at how we've approached our data centers, like many people, Discover has a long history with their own private data centers, right? We still have those data centers, right? And they're very specific to that stack. As we move into the cloud space, going back to the footprint, we're going to have edge scenarios. We're going to have potentially some of the major cloud providers. We don't want the experience for our development community to be different across those providers, right? Also, we can't scale our organization to support all the nuances associated with each of those cloud providers. So our approach is sort of redefining our data centers, and we call it data center in a box, but it's essentially through Kubernetes, creating a shim over the public cloud providers, right? And creating the consistent way for interacting with a public cloud, right? And that's through Kubernetes, right? And so all of these questions have to be answered when we take this approach, right? I'm not going to go through all of them here, but it highlights sort of some of the major domains that we're focused on in delivering sort of the shim across our public cloud providers. Now, understand this is a philosophical debate, right? Do you do cloud native, or do you create an abstraction over the cloud providers? Again, this strategy sort of is based on our understanding of regulations and where we need to be, the fact that we won't be able to be everywhere a public cloud provider is, and not having disparate solutions or inconsistent experiences of public cloud providers. So we're trying to provide one common abstraction up to our end users, our business, our developers, for them to realize and take advantage of the capabilities, right? All right, moving on. So if you look left to right, if you look on the left, right, we've already talked about we're obviously multi-cloud, right? And we'll be hybrid cloud here, effectively. So if you look at the left, our early phases with Kubernetes were sort of represented by mutually exclusive clusters. These are clusters within a single cloud provider that were kind of islands unto themselves, right? There was no federation. Once you deployed into a cluster, that was the context in which you lived, and there was no sort of going to other clusters unless it was a sort of a disaster, right, scenario. We also started with using managed cloud native services, right, because it was just easier, right? The scale and the demand, we couldn't meet that natively within the Kubernetes ecosystem, right? Services, data services running on Kubernetes, ML, AI, those types of platforms were sort of immature in the early goings, and we didn't want to essentially approach running those in Kubernetes. So that was in the left. Those are sort of the early phases, and this kind of goes back sort of the germination of Kubernetes at Discover, which is about 4 or 5 years, right? If you fast forward and sort of where we're at now, and some of this is sort of in flux and sort of just being delivered now, is our current phases, right? Again, going back to our global footprint, we're going to have Kubernetes clusters in multiple cloud providers. That's the reality, right? And there's multiple reasons for that I talked about previously. But again, we don't want to, duplicate sort of these islands, right? We don't want cloud provider A to be an island unto itself, right? With no awareness from applications that, cloud provider B, right, exists, or C, right? So there's two things that are happening, right? We're expanding Kubernetes into multiple providers, right? We're creating a mesh that ties us. So obviously a federated mesh, right, where discovery can happen across those. And there's an awareness of applications that, hey, I can discover applications running in any region of the world on any cluster, right? it should be seamless. I should be able to look it up. I should be able to fail over to it seamlessly, and I should be able to secure it. So that's the concept of federated service. So obviously, most of you have probably heard service mesh, right, as a concept. And so we're leveraging that heavily, right? There's also a second piece to it is we don't want our application teams to have to think about where they're running, right? Or how their workloads are being secured within a region. And so we want to securely and seamlessly move their workloads and their storage between cloud providers, right? And then lastly, we're going to take a measured approach to running Kubernetes hosted services. Again, the value is I'm not tied to a specific cloud provider, and I'm not tied there from an application perspective. So if I have to move my workload, from one cloud provider to another for any reason, I don't have hooks back into that cloud provider. So there's freedom of movement, not only from application workload, but for the services. And again, we're going to take a measured approach, right? Not everything is going to fit nicely into this model, right? There's very definitive, differentiated services within a cloud provider that we'll consume, that will create some form of stickiness, right? So that's sort of the general evolution of sort of how we view our multi-hybrid cloud and our Kubernetes evolution, right? What comes with the current phase is all the considerations and concerns around securing, our solutions are now exacerbated and multiplied by, the mesh, multiple cloud providers, workloads moving between them, additional services. So those are some of the things that we're facing. In fact, I talked a little bit about our cloud governance, right? I would say 3/4 of what we talk about is how we secure our workloads and our data, right? We've all heard the horror stories of different companies being exposed, S3 buckets, the data is our crown jewel. And so most of our governance is talks around security. And so while I'm not in the cybersecurity organization, right, as a cloud director in sort of rolling out these capabilities, we've been forced to sort of address a lot of these things independent of cybersecurity. And I'll talk about some of those challenges, right, and why that's had to happen. And so as I go through the deck. So obviously there's lots of security domains, right? I'm going to talk about a few of them here, right? This is just sort of logically how I've broken them up. Again, there's many more if you wanted to parse this, right? So infrastructure, that's how we provision our infrastructure across public and private clouds, right? The data I talked about, data is our crown jewel, right? We have to protect our data as a financial services. Any compromise of that is intolerable and extremely detrimental to a company, including ours. Services is, think typically microservices based. These are applications, right? How do I discover, how do I secure services that are distributed throughout the world, right, in a global footprint, right? Workloads are obviously services are manifested. They actually run as a workload, but it's very different when I talk about workloads. I'll get into that, what I mean about workloads and the security aspects of securing workloads versus services. And then lastly, it's users, our approach to sort of users. So I'm going to go through each of those at a very high level. So let's start with infrastructure management, right? This is how we provision public cloud resources, right? So the design elements, some call them principles, some call them directives. I've tried to distill it down to sort of 4 sort of high level ones. So everything is code. Everybody's heard infrastructure as a code, right? Automation, no snowflakes, right? No different here. We are not allowed to deploy to production environments, right, through a pipeline, right? It's non-negotiable, right? So we don't have snowflakes, we don't have human hands in there. Compliance is code, right? So we talked about creating infrastructure through pipelines and code, right? Our compliance as code is a very important part of that as well, right? The S3 thing that I talked about, right, was a misconfiguration, in some cases, a misconfiguration, making a bucket public, for instance, right? So we have compliance into the pipeline, both reactive, proactive, and reactive, right? To ensure that these things aren't getting out there into a public cloud provider. And then we have standardized delivery mechanisms, right? We don't have 6 ways, right? Could be Terraform, could be, Jenkins, just as open source projects. There's lots of things here that can satisfy this. So some of the relevant technologies that we have is we've adopted Kubernetes cluster configuration managers. This is entirely policy-driven cluster lifecycle management, right? So it's not dependent on one person making a decision. These are well-defined, enforced policies that deliver, right, standard things to all of our clusters, right, and ensure that there's no snowflakes, right? They'll bring it back into alignment to what the expected state of that is, right? The other things is we have multiple, ways of delivering products through operators, right? So Kubernetes operators is a standard way to codify some of the operational aspects of what's being run in Kubernetes, right? Continuous compliance engines. There's lots of them out there. All the public cloud providers generally have their own. There's other ones outside of that as well, right? We have the compliance engines looking at all the public cloud infrastructure and as well building those into pipelines to get sort of the proactive, right? So we have continuous compliance engines as part critical to what we do in the public and private cloud space. And then we really have worker node, taint, strict isolation policies, and I'll get that into workload, right? But we manage our infrastructure and create very specific set of infrastructures for very specific set of workloads, and I'll touch on that a little bit more. Data management, right? So obviously I talked already about data. It's the most critical part of our business, right? Any compromise of data is intolerable, right? And sort of very detrimental to any company, right? We've all seen the public disclosures of this. And so all sensitive data, right? Personal identifying information, PCI, obviously in the financial sector, PCI. Data at rest must have 2 forms of obfuscation. So public cloud providers provide key management system where you can encrypt it using keys that they provide. Some of them allow you to bring your own keys. On top of that, we say, hey, you need another form of obfuscation, other tokenization or encryption. So if one element is compromised, right, you're not compromised as a company and our customers' data is not compromised. All data in transit must be secured via transport level security, non-negotiable, right? We don't want people sniffing on the line for our data. And so TLS, regardless of the protocol, HTTPS, whatever, that's non-negotiable. All data transfers must traverse a clearinghouse. So the clearinghouse concept is the view of the world is public cloud is more dangerous than private cloud, right? I'm not going to get into a debate about that. But as we move data from our private on-premise data centers out to the public cloud, right? Understanding what data is moving out there and where it's going is imperative to controlling any potential leakage of that data, right? So the clearinghouse concept is data that traverses a cloud, right? It's moving from one cloud to another, has to traverse a clearinghouse where it's interrogated, right? Through specific technologies and potentially tokenized or encrypted, right? Such that we don't have teams just pushing data to random databases, and have leakage that way. And any unclear processing, right, must be done in memory with physical and logical isolation. And I'll touch a little bit more on this in the workload isolation piece. So some of the relevant technologies here. Obviously, the data loss prevention tools, right? All the public cloud providers generally have an offering. So essentially, it's sending your data through those detection and scrubbing technologies, right? Such that data is not living out there unprotected, right? I talked about tokenized and encryption tools. We've got tokenization and encryption tools in our toolbox that we use to tokenize all the data that I talked, all of our sensitive data, right? Secure file transfer platforms with full audits. Again, we want to know when people are moving data out to the cloud or between clouds, right? So secure file transfer, is imperative there. And then we create secure network isolated landing zones via declarative network policies, taints, and tolerations, right? So obviously, there's all sorts of providers in the declarative network policies space, right? But this is critical to creating isolation. All right, service management, right? So again, in a hybrid cloud and going back to sort of our evolution to a mesh-based view of the world, right? Service A living in cloud A, calling service B, landing in cloud B or C in a different region of the world, right? We need trust established there. And we establish trust boundaries, right? And the trust boundary could be at the service within that pod, it could be at the cluster level, it could be at the cloud layer, right? What we're saying is that one single control, security groups, network security groups, or network policy is not sufficient, right? If any of those things breaks down, right, we can't have unfettered access to the entities that are living on that network segment, right? So we have a second set of controls, right? Or require a second set of controls. Service registration with service producers and consumer relationships. We want to know who's out there and who's calling who and what the nature of the relationship is, right? Service trust via token certificate issued by trusted entities, right? So PKI, token issuance, right? There's solutions around there, but that is a must. Service isolation for APIs handling sensitive information. So this isn't mutually exclusive of the data conversation, but again, we need to isolate any services that are handling sensitive information, right? We have strategies to create secure enclaves for those folks. So some of the relevant technologies, layer 3 host and pod network ingress egress policies with layer 7 API auth-in auth-z via mesh, right? So you got the layer 3 for policies, you've got the layer 7 service mesh sort of auth-in auth-z, right? So even if network-wise there's a breakdown and you can have service A talking to service B, right? There's authentication and authorization and a contract between those services that would prevent that, right? An API governance portal, right? This is imperative, right? We don't want people just throwing services out into the world without knowing about them, right? So there's a strict registration process, relationship identification, and token issuance to each of our services, right? And then we talked about the mesh, right? So one part of the mesh is you've got trust, you've got routability, the governance and the registration with a centralized governing point is critical in our view on top of the mesh, right? And so those are some of the relevant technologies to the service management piece. All right, so I've already talked about workload management a couple different times. So one of our principles is you need to know your constituents. You need to know who's trying to deploy and what the characteristics of that workload application are, right? So you need to have exact metadata based on an application portfolio, right, about your application. Do you handle sensitive data, right? Are you in scope for PCI, for instance, right? Those types of things. Then we have to create physical and logical isolation of workloads based on application characteristics. So we know who you are, we know characteristics about your applications. We're going to place you into certain segments. That could be network segments, could be different nodes, physical, logical isolation. And then we're going to reject you. If we don't understand who you are and everything about you, right, and you're not aligning to our label taxonomy, we're going to reject your workloads, right? We don't want strangers, if you will, out in the public cloud provider. So some of the technologies that help, right, control this and enforce our principles are obviously application portfolio management, right, for application metadata. Everything about your application, we need to know about it, right? And that comes from a central trust authority, right? We obviously, like most people, probably use mutating and validating emission controllers to apply application metadata. So we don't allow applications and teams to just provide their own metadata, right? We control every aspect of that and ensure that we're applying the metadata as it's coming from the application portfolio management. So we'll mutate yours and create labels and then place you based on that, right? We've talked a little bit about taints and tolerations, right? We want certain nodes to repel certain workloads, right? And then we also want to ensure that we're placing certain workloads on certain nodes, right? So there's an infinity there. Declarative Kubernetes network policies for microsegmentation, right? So the promise of cyber loves this one, right? Microsegmentation, service A can only talk to these three things, right? And we know which the three things they're talking to because they're declaring those things. They have to declare them, right? And then we have visibility, right, with the tool. So tools that support microsegmentation and network policy are critical to our architecture and understanding the network flows within and outside of our environments. All right. So the last one is user management, right? Access to environments must be protected with multiple authentication factors, right? Kubernetes platform administrators should not have access to application secrets, right? So we need a bifurcation of sort of administrative rights. Secrets are managed external to the Kubernetes platform, right? All administrative activities only through call alter access with short-lived tokens, right? We don't have people with standing access to go in and SSH into hosts, right? Again, this goes, our whole goal is zero touch, right, with human hands, right? And if there is a break glass scenario, well, then we have a full audit and we know who's done what, right? And then highly sensitive workloads must run in restricted environments with no human access, right? So there's non-critical workloads where less concerned maybe about a human being in that environment. And then there's really highly sensitive environments that we lock down and we don't allow humans in there. And if we do in certain circumstances, again, it goes back to we must have certain set of really stringent audit processes, right? Such that we know. So relevant technologies, we know there's lots of multi-factor authentication providers, right? They're pretty well known. Externalization of secrets from Kubernetes secrets. So one of our principles is Kubernetes secrets aren't secret. That's the way we view them. So we externalize them with external vault providers. Short-lived tokens issued and tracked via secrets, right? Everything goes to SIM tools such that they can be evaluated. And then we have public cloud providers account segregation controlled, right? And again, through network policy with break glass user access only. Okay, so that's the user management. We generally try to lock down our environments, and some of them are extremely locked down. All right, so to wrap it up, a few lessons learned, as I've gone through the deck, as you're approaching your hybrid multi-cloud strategy and even, Kubernetes to a certain extent, you're going to get real philosophical difference on how and what you should be doing. Cloud native versus cloud agnostic. Do you want Kubernetes as a shim, right? So what's imperative there is what we found is you need to understand your business drivers, right? And you need to align your architecture that support it, right? So maybe Spotify is not the same as a bank, and the requirements and regulations around a music streaming service aren't the same, right? And maybe there's not a need to be able to extract yourself from a public cloud provider, or to be in different regions of the world, right? So understand your business drivers. That'll drive to a certain extent your architectures. And it's really important you find an executive champion for all of this. Otherwise, you'll flounder for years, right, with competing visions of the future. Bifurcated product ownership, right? This slows the delivery during critical development and adoption phases, right? As you get into some of these ecosystems and these tools and platforms, they're going to be new, right? And they're certainly going to be new to traditional data center folks, right? The more that you bifurcate that ownership in the early phases, the more you're compromising on delivery. So what we found has worked well is centralize your product ownership in the ecosystem during the critical early phases of this, right? And only pivot once products are well established within the enterprise, right? Skills gaps, it's a buyer's market. Many, we all are facing this, right? Again, we've talked about the skills gap and try to realize these new architectures. And then lastly, the technology explosion, right? There's so many choices, right? It's easy to get into analysis paralysis, right? But that just extends your timelines and sometimes significantly. So deciding what not to do is almost more important than deciding what you will do, right? You're going to get a lot of technologies coming at you. I probably get a dozen, 2 dozen a day from vendors, right? Stay focused, don't get distracted, right? There'll be a proper time to pivot, right? But generally speaking, lay out your strategy, lay out your architecture, and try to execute that without too many distractions, because it'll just compromise your timelines. Well, thank you. Thanks for coming to the session. Hopefully you learned something about not only Discover's journey, but something that can help you as you move along your journey to the cloud and execution of your strategy. So again, thank you very much for coming. It was a pleasure being here today.